Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a new episode of Great Books in 10 Minutes. By the end of this video, you will learn everything about Ernest Hemingway's masterpiece, The Sun Also Rises. The story begins with Jake Barnes, a wounded American veteran who had become impotent during the First World War, introducing us to Robert Cohn, a Jewish former middleweight boxing champion at Princeton. Despite disliking boxing, Cohn used it to overcome feelings of inferiority and shyness. His coach, Spider Kelly, permanently flattened his nose during a match. After graduation, Cohn's boxing championship went unrecognized, and he gave it up for good. Cohn came from a wealthy Jewish family. He married the first woman who showed him kindness, but after losing his inheritance and divorcing, he moved to California. In California, Cohn became involved in literary circles, backing an arts review magazine until it folded. Frances, his romantic partner, persuaded him to go to Europe. 2 years later, as Frances grew older, she became more insistent for Cohn to marry her. Cohn, who was receiving a reasonable monthly allowance from his mother, remained relatively content living in Europe and writing. Jake then recounts an incident where he suggested a trip to Strasbourg with Cohn to visit a female friend, which prompted visible jealousy from Frances. The incident at the cafe showed Frances's possessiveness, leading Cohn to avoid other women to appease her. Robert Cohn's trip to America marked a turning point in his life. His novel's acceptance by a prestigious publisher caused a rift with Frances, who noticed a change in him upon his return from New York. Cohn became more enamored with America, but also more complex, losing some of his simplicity and charm. The praise he received inflated his ego, especially coupled with newfound success in bridge games, which he began to boast about. Influenced by W.H. Hudson's romantic novel The Purple Land, Cohn saw life's possibilities through a romantic lens. He approached Jake with a proposal to travel to South America, seeking a deeper experience of life. Despite Jake's attempts to dissuade him and suggest living more fully in Paris, Cohn remained determined. Their conversation ended with Jake's polite invitation for drinks, which led to a candid discussion about the fear of missing out on life's opportunities. Jake empathized with Cohn's dilemma, but recognized the futility of convincing him otherwise. Cohn's stubbornness, rooted in his idealized notions from literature and his discontent with Paris, made him resistant to change. Jake sat alone outside a coffee house on a warm spring evening. A good-looking girl passed by, caught his eye, and joined him at the table. She ordered a drink, revealing her name as Georgette. Despite her initial sarcasm, their conversation revealed her cynical view of Paris. They shared a horse-drawn cab to a restaurant. In the cab, the girl put her hands on Jake's face and wanted to kiss him, but Jake declined and disclosed his war injury. At the restaurant, Jake met some of his friends and all went to a dance hall. After a few minutes, a beautiful woman named Brett arrived with a group of young men. Lady Brett Ashley was an English socialite and a friend of Jake, whom he had met while convalescing at a hospital during the war. Jake, not liking the rowdy youth who had accompanied Brett, left for a while, and when he returned, he saw Georgette dancing with one of them. At that moment, Robert Cohn, who was enamored with Brett's beauty, asked her to dance with him, but Brett declined and told him that she was going to dance with Jake. During the dance, Jake told Brett that it seemed like she had added Cohn to the list of his admirers. Jake and Brett then got into a taxi and left the bar together. In the car, Jake and Brett shared a passionate kiss, but Brett abruptly withdrew, citing her aversion to physical touch despite her love for Jake. Jake proposed keeping their distance, but Brett insisted on seeing him, despite the inevitable challenges. As they locked eyes, Brett reflected on her past actions and their consequences, saying that her love for Jake and Jake's injury is the price that she has to pay for the hell that she put men through. Jake tried to shift the conversation away from his own struggles, which were often trivialized by others. Upon arriving at the bar, Brett was introduced to a count by a portrait painter named Duke. The count treated Brett to champagne and invited Jake to join. But Jake declined and left while he learned of Georgette's behavior and Cohn's miserable state while going home with Frances. Jake bid farewell to Brett, who promised to meet him the next day at a hotel. Brett also confirmed receiving a letter from her fiancé Mike, who would soon travel to Paris. Jake arrived home alone. In bed, he began reading papers about bullfighting, but his mind soon wandered to his war injury that had left him impotent. He reflected on the advice from the Catholic Church to not dwell on this condition, wondering if meeting Brett after being wounded was the beginning of his troubles. Later, Jake was awoken by a commotion downstairs. A drunk Brett was arguing with the concierge who wouldn't let her up. Once Jake intervened, Brett came to his room, recounting how the wealthy count had offered her $10,000 to vacation with him, which she claimed to have declined. However, she admitted telling the count she loved Jake, and that the count had invited Jake to join them for an extravagant dinner the following evening. As Brett prepared to leave, she invited Jake to join her and the count for breakfast. Jake stated he was too far behind the night to be any fun. Alone again, Jake poured out his remaining drink, got into bed, and felt miserable thinking of Brett being with another man. On a pleasant Parisian morning, Jake enjoyed a leisurely walk, observing the lively street scenes before heading to his office. He was joined for lunch by Cohn, who admitted his writing wasn't going well. The conversation turned to Brett, her impending divorce, and plans to marry Mike Campbell. Cohn confessed he found Brett remarkably attractive and may be in love with her, though Jake insisted Brett loved Mike. Cohn didn't believe Brett would marry someone she didn't love. Jake stated matter-of-factly that Brett had married twice before without love. Cohn took great offense at this, perceiving it as an insult to Brett's character. An argument erupted, with Cohn demanding Jake apologize for his comments about Brett. After they calmed down and reaffirmed their friendship, Jake deftly avoided any further discussion of Brett when he sensed Cohn wanted to revisit the topic. They spent the rest of their time together discussing other matters before Jake departed for the office. Jake found himself waiting for Brett at the hotel at 5 o'clock. When she didn't show up, he wrote some letters and left. During a stroll around Paris, he contemplated if it was the association of ideas that caused dead spots on journeys and made people not like certain places. He then pondered if Robert Cohn's inability to enjoy Paris stemmed solely from reading the works of H.L. Mencken, who notoriously disliked the city. Later at a cafe, he reunited with Robert Cohn, whose earlier writing confidence had diminished. Jake reflected that Cohn never exhibited issues until falling for Brett. Even his once beloved tennis game fell apart afterwards. Frances, Cohn's fiancée, soon arrived and asked Jake to accompany her for a walk. During their walk, she revealed the news that Cohn no longer wished to marry her, claiming he hadn't lived enough. Frances confided to Jake that the real reason Cohn got cold feet was his desire to experience success from an upcoming book release in New York that fall. Frances continued that Cohn prioritized personal achievement over marriage. When they returned from their walk and sat at the table again, an emotional Frances went on an embarrassing rant about Cohn right in front of him. During her outburst, she sarcastically berated Cohn's emotional immaturity, his tendency to cry around women, and his seeming wish to keep a mistress rather than a wife. As Frances's denigrating rant continued, Jake politely excused himself, slipped out a side door, hailed a taxi, and retreated to his flat, leaving a displeased Cohn behind at the coffee house. Jake returned to his apartment, greeted by a concierge whose attitude toward Brett had significantly improved thanks to the generous tip she had left. He was informed that Brett and the Count would soon return to meet him. As he showered, Brett and the Count arrived to collect him. Sensing Jake's distress, Brett noticed his extended preparation time. Upon discovering him lying face down on the bed, she sent the Count to fetch champagne and bought herself some time to be alone with Jake. Jake proposed living together, but Brett foresaw herself being unfaithful. Jake then suggested going to the countryside for a while, but Brett declined, saying she couldn't live a quiet life and didn't want to hurt her one true love. She then mentioned leaving soon for San Sebastian. After the Count returned with great champagne, regaling them with stories of his past arrow wounds, the trio went out for dinner and dancing. However, Brett suddenly grew distressed while dancing with Jake and requested to be taken home. Outside Brett's apartment, she kissed Jake goodbye, saying they would not meet again. Jake did not hear from Brett again until after her return from San Sebastian. With Frances in England, Robert Cohn had also disappeared, though he left Jake his bank details to contact him through it. Jake enjoyed this freedom while getting ready to leave for their Spain fishing trip with his writer friend Bill Gorton at the end of June. Bill returned from a trip to Vienna and Budapest, recounting how he witnessed an African wrestler being pelted by the crowd after beating the local champion. On a stroll, Bill jokingly suggested buying Jake a stuffed dog and horse, making humorous remarks and telling Jake that a stuffed dog would brighten up his dull flat. They then ran into Brett on the street and invited her for drinks before her fiancé Mike's return. Later, Jake and Bill joined Brett and a drunken Mike for dinner, where Mike kept drunkenly going on about Brett's beauty and at the same time disparaging the hat she was wearing. When Jake told Bill about Mike's annoying continuous remarks about his fiancé's allure, Bill said he didn't blame him. Jake received a letter from Robert Cohn wanting to join him and Bill on their upcoming fishing trip to Spain. Jake agreed for Cohn to meet them in Bayonne before traveling together to Pamplona. Jake also visited Brett and her fiancé Mike at a bar, where Mike asked if he and Brett could join the fishing trip as well, to which Jake agreed with plans to all meet up in Spain. After Mike left, Brett revealed to Jake that Robert Cohn was the person with whom she had gone to San Sebastian. Jake became angry initially, but then suggested Brett inform Cohn to give him a chance to opt out of the trip, considering her fiancé was going to be there. On the train to Spain, Jake and Bill encountered a group of Catholic pilgrims who had booked the dining car, forcing them to make do with sandwiches and wine in their compartment. At the Bayonne station, they were reunited with Robert Cohn and took a cab to his hotel, where they would all stay. Before departing to Pamplona, Jake, Bill, and Robert Cohn explored Bayonne under the radiant sun. Upon their arrival at the Montoya Hotel in Pamplona, they indulged in a Spanish lunch, during which Cohn's nervousness about his past with Brett in San Sebastian became apparent. Witnessing Cohn's self-righteous attitude, Bill challenged him to a bet regarding Brett and Mike's arrival, with Bill confident they would come that night, while Cohn was certain they would be late as usual. Following lunch, Jake ventured to familiar spots in Pamplona, including the cathedral, where he prayed for himself, his friends, and a successful bullfighting festival. Jake then, seeing Cohn's desperate efforts to impress Brett, like getting a haircut and shaving, deliberately accompanied Cohn to the train station. He did so to both amuse himself with Cohn's annoyance because of his presence and to observe Cohn's nervousness. To their disappointment, Brett and Mike were not on the train. Cohn was so disappointed that he relinquished his bet with Bill. Later that night, Jake received a telegram from Mike, revealing their delayed arrival so Brett could recuperate. Upon hearing this, Cohn decided to stay behind and wait for Brett, promising to rejoin Jake and Bill in the mountains with Brett and Mike. Jake found Bill, who while shaving his face revealed that Cohn had confided in him about having a date with Brett in San Sebastian. Bill mocked Cohn's presence on the trip, though he admitted liking Cohn despite finding him awful. Bill then ranted about Brett's foolishness in going to San Sebastian with Cohn instead of someone like himself or Jake. He then jokingly praised his own face as trustworthy for women. Ultimately, Bill was glad Cohn wouldn't be joining them for trout fishing in the Irati River, and he and Jake eagerly anticipated getting drunk on wine before their bus trip. The bus journey was lively, with Basque passengers offering drinks and playful banter, making the trip enjoyable for Jake and Bill. Arriving in the mountains, they encountered a police officer who checked their fishing permits before they settled into an inn run by a stout woman. To combat the chill, Bill played the piano while Jake negotiated the room rate, and they warmed up with hot rum punches. In the morning, Jake woke up and dug up some worms for bait. Bill woke up and they had coffee and buttered toast. Bill teased Jake about digging worms and accused him of being an expatriate who had lost touch with his roots. Bill also mentioned that some people thought expatriates were impotent, which Jake dismissed. They joked about the Civil War being about Abraham Lincoln's love for General Grant. They then packed a lunch and wine for their fishing trip and left. Jake and Bill went fishing, with Jake catching 6 trout using worms and Bill catching 4 larger trout using a fly. They cooled the wine, ate their lunch, and drank the wine. Bill made a humorous tribute to William Jennings Bryan by reversing the order of eating the chicken and eggs. As they became drunk, Bill asked Jake if he had ever been in love with Brett, which Jake admitted but didn't want to discuss further. They took a nap and then walked back to the hotel. Jake and Bill stayed at the inn for 5 more days, swimming and playing bridge with an Englishman named Harris in the evenings. While staying at the inn, one morning, the Englishman Harris gave Jake a letter from Mike, informing him that they would reach Montoya Hotel in Pamplona on Tuesday and asking Jake how to join them. Jake decided to leave for Pamplona that afternoon to meet their friends. They also received a telegram from Cone saying he was coming on Thursday. Jake sent a telegram back, stating they would be back that very night, so there was no need for Mike, Brett, and Cone to travel. Jake and Bill arrived at the Montoya Hotel in Pamplona, where preparations were underway for the fiesta. Jake explained Montoya's passion for bullfighting and how he separated the aficionados from commercial bullfighters. They all watched as the bulls were released into the corrals. Mike taunted Cone, likening him to a steer following Brett wherever she went, suggesting he should know better than to linger where he's not wanted. Despite the tension, they enjoyed a pleasant supper, with Brett radiating beauty and the group fostering a lively atmosphere reminiscent of wartime dinners, where calm coexisted with chaos and danger. Jake was very drunk after dinner and stood on the balcony. He reflected on disliking Brett being with other men and the cost of friendships with women, which went beyond money. Jake wished Mike would hurt Cone, but also didn't like Mike berating him every chance he got. He called his dilemma morality and then decided that he should call it immorality rather than morality. He then mused about the English language as spoken by British people, before finally falling asleep toward daylight after more reading. The next 2 days were calm, with preparations for the fiesta continuing. Brett told Jake she would love to hear him confess, and they went to visit the local cathedral. They saw Cone outside the church, realizing he had followed them there. Jake, not wanting to embarrass Cone further, decided to not say anything. The 3 of them then went to a gypsy camp, where Brett had her fortune told. On July 6th, a rocket burst announced the start of the fiesta in Pamplona, with people pouring in from the countryside. Jake, Bill, Cone, Brett, and Mike watched a religious procession with effigies of giants, Moors, a king and queen, and dancers passing through the streets. At a wine shop, the group partied with festival goers, and Brett learned how to drink from a wineskin from the locals. The next day at the bullfight, Jake cautioned Brett against watching the horses after they were struck by the bulls. Afterward, he went back to the hotel to fetch his wine and was introduced to the young bullfighter Pedro Romero by the hotel owner, Montoya. Throughout the bullfight, Jake guided Brett through the nuances of the spectacle. Pedro Romero emerged as a standout talent, far surpassing the other matadors. Brett was mesmerized by Romero's mastery, his effortless control over the bulls, and his good looks. Despite the rain, the fiesta persisted the following day. Montoya sought Jake's counsel regarding the American ambassador's invitation to Pedro Romero, fearing the potential corruption of the young bullfighter. Jake advised against conveying the message, expressing concern for Romero's well-being and cautioning Montoya about an American woman, meaning Brett, who collected bullfighters. At the restaurant, they encountered Romero conversing with a bullfighting critic. Jake introduced Romero to his companions, and the young bullfighter engaged with them politely. Jake intervened when Mike, inebriated, began disparaging Cone and insinuating about Brett's interest in Romero, preventing the situation from escalating. The group then headed outside to watch fireworks, albeit disrupted by the wind. Later at a bar, Bill spotted an acquaintance named Edna. Then the two of them, accompanied by Mike, left to mess with the English patrons. Fed up with Cone following her everywhere like a hopeless romantic, Brett lashed out at him, telling him to leave her and Jake alone so they could talk. When Cone left, Brett told Jake she was in love with Pedro Romero, and that once she wanted something, she must have it. Brett asked Jake to stay on her side and help her. Jake and Brett ended up in a cafe where they encountered Pedro Romero. Romero played along with Brett's flirtations, joking about her reading his fortune and asking her to tell him he would live forever and become a millionaire. Jake left Brett and Romero alone for a while. Upon returning, Jake realized they had gone together. Jake found Bill, Mike, and Edna outside a bar where they had been thrown out by the police for bothering the patrons. Mike revealed that he was completely bankrupt. On their way to another bar, they encountered Robert Cone. Cone became aggressive when Jake wouldn't tell him where Brett had gone, and Mike drunkenly told Cone that Brett was with Pedro Romero. Enraged, Cone called Jake a pimp and knocked him down with a punch. As Jake walked back to the hotel, everything looked new and strange to him, like when he had been kicked in the head during a football game in his hometown. Bill told him to go see Robert Cone, who was in a bad state, and asked for him. Jake went to Cone's room, where Cone was lying face down on the bed, crying. Cone apologized to Jake for his behavior, saying he couldn't stand Brett treating him like a stranger after they had lived together in San Sebastian. He asked Jake to forgive him, saying Jake was his only friend. Jake told Cone he forgave him, and Cone said he was leaving in the morning. Jake woke up with a headache, remembering he had promised Edna, Bill's friend, that he would take her to watch the bulls run into the ring. He witnessed the chaotic scene as the bulls charged through the crowd, goring and trampling several people, including one man who was severely injured after being tossed into the air by a bull's horn. Despite the violence, the crowd cheered as the bulls entered the ring. In a conversation with a waiter at the hotel, the waiter expressed his disdain for bullfighting, saying it was stupid to risk one's life just for fun. Jake later found out that the injured man had died. The next day, the deceased man's wife and two little children came to collect his body. A funeral ensued, with the coffin being transported by train back to his town, accompanied by the widow and children riding in a third-class wagon. The bull that killed the man was later killed that afternoon by Pedro Romero, who cut off its ear as a trophy and gave it to Brett. Jake returned to the hotel, went up to his room, and lay down, not feeling sleepy despite the early hour. Bill and Mike soon joined him, recounting the chaotic events of the morning's bull run, where many people were injured by the bulls. They made fun of Jake for getting punched by Cone the previous night. Jake asked where Cone went after hitting him. Mike revealed that Cone had found Brett and Romero together in Romero's room and beat the young bullfighter, knocking him down repeatedly. He had then tried to take Brett with him and make an honest woman out of her. Bill and Mike mockingly continued that Brett defended Romero, and Cone ended up crying and wanting to shake hands with Romero. The bullfighter, despite being repeatedly knocked down by Cone, found a chance and, pretending that he wanted to shake his hand, punched him in the face. Mike found the whole situation amusing but also unpleasant. Mike then talked about Brett's unhappy marriage to her first husband, Lord Ashley, who would make her sleep on the floor and threaten to kill her with a loaded gun every night. Despite this, Mike said Brett enjoyed life. The next day and at noon, as Jake, Bill, and Mike were eating, Brett showed up, and after making sure that Cone had left, she joined them. Mike, being drunk as always, made a few remarks about Brett being with Pedro Romero, and angrily flipped over the table. Brett asked Jake to take a walk with him. After briefly mentioning that Pedro Romero had been badly injured by Cone, Brett asked Jake to accompany him to a chapel where she could pray for the young bullfighter. At the chapel, however, she felt uneasy, and they left. Later that day, the bullfight began, with three of the best bullfighters, Belmonte, Marcial, and Pedro Romero, taking turns facing the bulls. Belmonte, who had been a legendary bullfighter in his youth, and had retired as the undisputed champion, was booed by the crowd due to his slow moves and riskless performance. Young Pedro Romero, however, impressed everyone with his skilled and graceful bullfighting despite his injuries from the previous fight with Cohn. Romero's performance with a bull that was colorblind was particularly impressive, as he had to rely on his body movements to guide the bull's charges. Outside the bull ring, Bill asked Jake where Cohn went, and Jake reluctantly replied that he must have gone to his old girlfriend Frances. Seeing Jake's miserable state, Bill bought him a few rounds of drinks to help him feel better. At the hotel, Mike told Jake that Brett was looking for him to say goodbye and that she had already left with Pedro Romero. The fiesta in Pamplona was over, and Jake woke up the next morning to find the town empty. He met up with Bill, and they decided to get a car to Bayonne, where Bill would catch a train to Paris. They also discussed Mike's plans to go to Saint-Jean-de-Luz. Along the way, Mike opted to stay with them for a bit longer. Jake, Bill, and Mike stopped at a bar, where they rolled dice for drinks. They then drove along the coastal road, passing through various villages. When it was time for Bill to catch his train, they stopped at the hotel where Mike would stay. After bidding farewell to Mike, Jake accompanied Bill to the train station, and there they said goodbye. Jake returned to Bayonne and checked into a hotel he had stayed at previously. He spent the afternoon reading newspapers and feeling strange about being back in France after the fiesta in Spain. Jake had dinner at a cafe in Bayonne, enjoying the wine and the simple pleasures of being in France. He appreciated the straightforward and transactional nature of French service, and tipped generously to make friends, knowing he might return. The next morning, Jake took a train to San Sebastian. He checked into a hotel with a balcony overlooking the town and green mountainside. After settling in, he went for a swim at the beach and observed the bicycle race passing through. Jake watched the bicycle riders at their hotel, amused by their friendship and togetherness. He spoke with a team manager who praised the sport and claimed France was becoming the most sporting country. Just as Jake was enjoying his time in San Sebastian, he received telegrams from Brett asking him to come to Madrid as she was in trouble. He booked a place on the express train for the next day. Jake arrived in Madrid and located Brett at the Hotel Montana. The proprietress was initially reluctant to allow him to see Brett, but eventually gave in. Jake reunited with Brett, who had recently parted ways with the young bullfighter. Brett revealed she had been considering marrying the young bullfighter but decided against it, as she didn't want to ruin him. She was relieved to be free of the situation, but also emotional about it. Brett expressed her intention to return to her fiancé Mike despite his flaws, stating that he was both nice and awful just like herself. Over martinis, Brett mentioned the young bullfighter's inexperience with women before her and felt good about deciding not to continue with him. At lunch, Jake and Brett discussed the nature of belief, with Brett suggesting her decision not to take advantage of young Pedro Romero was akin to having a god. Jake inquired about her plans, and they agreed to have more wine. Over more wine, Jake became intoxicated, prompting Brett to caution him against getting drunk. Despite her concerns, Jake suggested going for a ride to see Madrid. Brett lamented the good time they could have had together, and Jake acknowledged the poignancy of her sentiment. Your support is crucial in helping me to create further episodes. To contribute, kindly consider becoming a member, liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel. For those inclined to donate, secure links are provided in the description box. Thank you sincerely, and see you in the next episode.